But Mr. Clark, the Health Secretary, insists the dispute has little to do with him. Visiting a Nottingham hospital today, he was reluctant to answer questions.
NUPE are organising it. You must ask NUPE. They're gambling with patient safety in the interests of a pay claim. I don't approve of that. Management are offering talks to them.
Doesn't there come a point when you intervene, though, Secretary of State?
I am not negotiating. It's the unions who refuse me.
The Health Minister Kenneth Clarke walking out of the ITN News last Monday was the latest in a tradition of great TV walkouts started by Harold Wilson back in the 60s. The political interview has changed a lot since the days when the Prime Minister was invited to address the nation. Nowadays it can seem more like an arena of political combat. But how fair is the fight? Politicians, of course, are quick to complain about unfair treatment at the hands of television's tougher interrogators. They increasingly lay down the terms on which they're prepared to appear on television. The trouble is that in this battle of wills, it's the viewer who's often the loser, deprived, for example, of confrontations like this.
If I can just break in there, with respect, what do you say to Mr. Hawke and a number of other leaders within the Commonwealth, black leaders too, who say that the time is running out, and that the major risk now is that the moderate black leaders, black African leaders, may well be swept aside by a newer radical generation, and that the prospect of peaceful change will just evaporate?
I spoke to Chief Buthelezi.
But how representative is he of black Africans?
Chief Buthelezi is the chief of the Zulus, who are the biggest nation in southern Africa.
But he is
by far the biggest nation in southern Africa.
He has nothing like the popular support of Mandela, Tambo or Tutu.
The ANC operates outside South Africa. The Zulus and Chief Buthelezi and Chief Mabuza are inside South Africa. And my reply, if you will let me have it.
The sort of interview rarely seen in Britain, and not just because it was on Australian television. Politicians in general, and Mrs. Thatcher in particular, go to considerable lengths to avoid the hostile interview.
Margaret Thatcher became the first Prime Minister ever to appear on a chat show, a serving Prime Minister. And I remember very well, she walked onto the set of the Michael Aspel show, and she was wearing this glistening red fuchsia dress, and she looked rather glamorous, and Michael Aspel asked her nice, gentle questions, and she smiled and laughed and even told a few jokes, some of which she didn't intend to. And the reason she was on that show was because her advisors told her, this was at the time of the miners' strike, and in the summer of the miners' strike, when Arthur Scargill was making all the running, and her advisors told her that the image that was coming over at that stage, before all the violence was really happening in the miners' strike, was that the government was harsh and uncaring, and Mrs. Thatcher was seen as the harsh and uncaring head of that government. So it was useful for her to put on this maternal, attractive, fluffy image.
And so I was very grateful to you when you gave me the invitation. And you're quite right, I'm just hoping the question time will be so much kinder than the one I'm used to on Tuesday night. And I think it's a lot less noisy. I think you actually let me be heard here.
Well, we're after a different kind of answers, that's the thing.
But much as they'd like to, politicians can't always avoid the searching political questions. BBC's On the Record is Britain's newest political programme. The centrepiece is a live political interview by Jonathan Dimbleby. For politicians trained in the art of television techniques, it can provide a platform to put their message across. So how do you prevent them from turning the interview into a party political broadcast?
Form a three-point turn in a cul-de-sac and get back to the big time.
My own practice is to let them put that message across right at the very top, so that if they then seek simply to repeat the message, I can remind them, and more particularly the audience, that they've already done that. And that message raises a certain set of questions which the audience, through me, would like to address. And I will then address those questions with, I hope, courtesy, certainly persistence. And if I haven't got the kind of answers to those questions that I think constitute answers, I will point them out. I am not in a law court. The interviewee is not under oath, nor am I a torturer. So I cannot oblige the interviewee to say something that he or she does not wish to say. However, I can push very hard. You are not prepared to contemplate, Foreign Secretary, that under these circumstances, what was accepted in 1981 may not be tolerable to a tolerant British society and therefore subject to possible change.
Yes, let me again present the thing to you directly. I do not wish to be put here, as it were, being charged or cross-examined by you, as I am insensitive to these matters. During the whole of my time as Foreign Secretary, a great deal of my energy and effort has been directed to trying to establish a secure prospect for the people of Hong Kong.
The major politician will often, if he thinks he's under pressure, appeal to the audience over the head of the interviewer. I don't suppose he did come on with the purpose of being cross-examined. However, like any major politician, when he does come onto a programme, and Sir Geoffrey is as understanding of that as anyone else, he knows he is going to be pushed. I was pushing him on a key aspect of policy, and it's a legitimate part of the television interview. If you couldn't do that, then you would be into the position where television interviews were simply means by which politicians gave another version of the party political broadcast. And I hope that the British public would be extremely cross if we ever allowed that to happen.
There are those who take the view that it is part of our function to explain the workings of government to the governed. I rather take the view that there's already an elaborate government publicity machine which costs many millions of pounds a year, which already does that. My personal philosophy is that one is only there as a representative of the citizen, and that it is your job as a representative of the citizen to try to render the government, or those who govern, or those who are influential or powerful, accountable to those who are governed or poor or impotent.
Since your party came to power, more people are without a job, more people are without a home, more old people are afraid to go out of their homes, more people are being raped, more people are being mugged, and more people are being murdered. It's not much of a record, is it?
Well, if you put it that way, of course it isn't. But, you know, anybody can make facile comments like that.
To avoid being put on the spot by an awkward question, politicians will sometimes resort to outright intimidation.
Well, there may be all sorts of legitimate reasons for certain questions not being asked, legal reasons, questions of privacy, intrusion into private grief, and so on. Those are legitimate reasons for not asking a question. You can accede to such a request. But there are politicians who say, if you ask me that question, you will regret it. If you ask me that question, I will take it up with the Director General. If you ask me that question, I will walk out. Now, clearly, you tend to concentrate the mind a bit when you're on in 20 seconds and a politician is saying that to you. My personal view is that unless the question falls into that first category, you absolutely have to ask it. If you were going to ask it and you choose not to ask it, then you betray the people whom you're supposed to be representing, on whose behalf you're putting the question. So you have to put it. You can't possibly agree to those sort of attempts at blackmail and bullying.
Just doesn't quite work.
In many cases, politicians seek to lay down the conditions on an interview long before they get to the studio. They'll insist on appearing live, they insist on having the last word, and they'll often refuse to debate an issue with opposition politicians.
We're into a government now that's been running for over a decade. It has developed a certain self-confidence, and some of the officials associated with that government have also developed a certain self-confidence. And that, I think, tends to lead them to believe that they can lay down all sorts of conditions about the circumstances under which their ministers will appear.
I'm in the business of giving as much of the control of the situation as possible to the minister. Now, if he appears live and last in a programme, that obviously gives him a much greater degree of control over the delivery of his message, because if he appears live, you can't cut what he says and put it out of context, or choose the 30 seconds that the programme wants to use as opposed to the 30 seconds that the minister wants to get across.
Live programmes give politicians greater control, and as a result they're often reluctant to appear on pre-recorded programmes like This Week.
We made a programme about the trade deficit and wanted a Treasury spokesman to take part. It was a filmed report, and we wanted therefore the interview to be on film. And we were told that someone with from the Treasury would only take part, first if it was live, Secondly, if he had seen the programme beforehand, thus giving him an advantage over everyone else. So we said no.
If you are pre-recording, it gives the programme maker a much greater say in the use of the material. And there is the potential, should the programme maker want to do it, to intercut a minister's answer to an interview question and put it up against a statement or a claim from someone who wasn't asking that question.
What they're really saying, the hidden text in those complaints about editing, is not that they believe they'll be edited unfairly, but that they will not have control. That's what they don't like.
So Henry Leach said, and I apologise for quoting him again, but he's been 45 years in the Navy, and I suppose he knows something about it. The cuts in the Royal Navy's budget plans are twice the Army cuts and 7 times the RAF cuts.
The forward plans had to be trimmed because they were greater than the sum of money available. And as I say, you wouldn't expect the First Sea Lord to say anything else.
But even when they do appear live, there are some occasions when professional politicians can lose control.
To maintain a balance between all 3 services, and most expert opinion, setting aside those who want to drive divisions between the services, is of the opinion that we've probably got the balance about right.
But why should the public on this issue, as regards the future of the Royal Navy, believe you, a transient, here today and, if I may say so, gone tomorrow politician, rather than a senior officer of many years' experience?
I'm fed up with this interview, really. It's a ridiculous rolling room.
Well, thank you, Mr. Knott.
Today it's the turn of the Greens, Britain's newest political party, to be grilled by Jonathan Dimbleby. How will they respond to the horse trading that's become the hallmark of their political rivals?
Should you pay their price to save the planet? That and more goes on the record after the news at 1 o'clock with Maura Stewart.
Providing we feel we're getting a fair deal from the people who are interviewing us, we are not going to be in the business of laying down those very, very strict conditions. That, it seems to me, is the way people go when they're very frightened about the way they're going to come across.
You are seeking desperately to persuade the voters to change their ways, to accept a reduction in standard of living, and you're offering them what you've just offered them in compensation. If they say, we're not persuaded by that, we don't buy that, we're not going to change our ways. It's no good you just then putting your hands up in the air in despair. What do you then do about it? You've got to take action to bring that about, haven't you, if you had power to do it? What do you do?
Well, there's an assumption in having power to do it, and obviously what you do if you are in power is very different to what you do if you're in our situation now. The Greens like to do things differently. We don't necessarily want to follow in the footsteps of the other politicians and the way in which they do politics. We think that their style actually gets politics generally a very bad name.
Their political opponents are unlikely to revise their attitudes towards the programme makers. For as long as politicians have a vested interest in selecting the facts to suit their policies, they will always find themselves in conflict with the broadcasters.
You haven't got my script?
No.
You've only to look at what actually happens when the way government is operating is revealed in public, as it was, say, at the time of the Westland affair, and Heseltine suddenly blew the gaff on the whole thing. And the gap between what the politicians were saying was going on and what was really going on was enormous.
I think we've seen over the last few years a much better coordinated presentation of government policy, a more sophisticated understanding of newspaper and broadcasting deadlines, and a very clever ability to get the headlines that people want. Now, Harold Wilson was pretty good at it, but this administration seems to have got rather better. And once or twice, noticeably, I would say, obviously, over Death in the Rock, straightforward lies have been shoved out.
I do think that the piece of advice that Louis Heron was given when he started out as a young man on the Times by an old hack, he was told that you should always ask yourself, when talking to any politician, you should always have the question nagging at the back of your mind, why is this lying bastard lying to me? And I think that's quite a sound principle from which to operate.